Hey everyone, so this video I didn't plan on making. It's not going to have an ad in it. It's just going to be kind of a talking head video addressing some of the points brought up in our previous fix or flop video. I feel like this is warranted because there were a few concerns that I do definitely want to clarify. I want to clear up just for my sake, so that going forward this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. I also want to talk about a misconception I had about the system and how I really didn't fully act on my own words when I talked about trusting the owner of the system and how you kind of need to verify things yourself before moving forward. If they say that the system doesn't turn on, you kind of need to check that ahead of time, right? Especially if that system is now in your possession and you're more or less responsible for it. So the first point I want to talk about, I have a few here just listed on my phone, is the goal of the playlist, and that's to get the viewer back up and running. Okay, fix or flop, can I fix it? Can I not? Can we get the system to turn on when before it wasn't powering at all? Maybe it was turning on, but we weren't getting a post. My goal is just to get you back to square one where the system works as intended, okay? There's really nothing to it except for that. The second point I want to talk about is that the motherboard in question, so folks, for the most part, we're happy with the way that we fixed the board, right? Bending those pins in an LGA socket's just a pain in the butt. And some of you mentioned how you're not looking forward to AM5 being kind of the same design where the pins are actually in the socket and not on the chip. Yeah, pros and cons to both. I tend to like pins on the chip a bit better. They're just usually a tad bit stronger. They're not flexible. And I think there's just less risk overall. You're not dropping a CPU, hopefully, very often, but it's very possible to drop things in the socket, to scrape things, and that can lead to pretty serious issues like the one we saw in the video. But a few were concerned about motherboard integrity, and specifically they were saying that because the pins, the two pins that were bent all the way backwards, that were then repositioned to be in the places they need to be, were so thin at the bases, right? Because when you bend metal enough times, right, that metal's just going to snap. Well, you could see in that close-up microscope shot that I had, where the pin was pretty much just halfway gone at the base. It was still working just fine, but some folks were like, well, that board's toast. It's a half-measure fix. You didn't do a good job. You needed to just replace the board outright. Look, replacing things is easy. Anybody could just replace the board and call it a day. I really wanted to get the pins back in place. And if this becomes an issue again in the future where the pin completely snaps off, which I doubt at this point because it's been working the way that it has since we fixed it as far as I'm aware, but if it gets to the point where that pin breaks and it doesn't work any longer, at that point, yeah, sure, we can swap boards. That's totally fine. But I'm not going to do that if I don't need to. It's not like motherboards grow on trees here. Yes, I can get a lot of stuff for free from companies, but it's not like they get here in seconds. I have to wait usually several days for samples to arrive, and then swapping out a motherboard outright, it's not something that I take lightly, and I know it looks fairly simple to do on video. When you're seeing it on your end, it's like, oh yeah, I can just cut straight to when the motherboard's installed, piece of cake. But I really wanted to take the time to try to fix the original board and avoid replacing hardware if possible. Because if I was doing this as a business, in the sense that I was charging folks, then it'd be easy to just say, I can replace the board. It's going to cost you $200 plus labor. That's a $300, $400 bill depending on how you handle it. And that's not something that you want the viewer to have to pay if you can help it. If you're trying to just keep the cost down and keep the effectiveness of the fix up, then you just simply rebend the pins on the original board. They don't have to pay for a new board. They'll just pay for some labor, and that's it. 50, 60 bucks, whatever you charge, out the door. Of course, we don't charge anything for this, but people act like we're a business in it to make money, and I don't know. The point is, the motherboard now works. I'm not worried about the integrity of those pins. Yes, they are thinner at the bases, but I don't think it's going to be an immediate concern. Even if it was, there's no harm there. We can just swap the motherboard out at that point. But for now, there's no need to, and I'm not going to dip into my own pocket to buy a board overnight to replace that really doesn't need it. So it's easy to critique in that sense when you're just watching, but there's a method to my madness, and I don't want to replace things just because. I'd rather, focus on the specific issue at hand. Anyway, the next thing was the BIOS revision on the board. Now, some of you noticed that the BIOS revision was older than it needed to be. It was a much older version. And I actually have a video coming out soon talking about this very thing from it was a different video, but talking about how updating your BIOS can very easily fix CPU stability issues. If you're not getting a post whereas before you were and you didn't really change anything about your system, it's possible that just the AGESA update or what have you, especially if it's an AMD system, it's just no longer working for that chip. You know, tech degrades over time, and so the need to push out newer revisions to increase stability in platforms becomes rather warranted. And so that's something that I've made a conscious effort going forward to check, is the BIOS revision on the board, and if we're getting specific symptoms that I think warrant an update, I will certainly take care of it. However, in this case, I thought that the CPU that I was putting into his system to replace his chip was from the same generation. So I did not suspect that the BIOS in the board was incompatible with 9th gen Intel. And by the way, the context here is going to be a bit odd to pick up on if you haven't seen that Fix or Flop episode. I'll have it linked in the description if you haven't already seen it. But long story short, the CPU that I gave him was actually an 8400, not a 9400 like I thought. So the 8400 worked because, well, it's an older generation chip. It's more stable with that BIOS revision. And I'm not entirely sure because I don't have the system in front of me anymore, but it might have been the case that that BIOS revision didn't even support 9th gen Intel out of the gate, and that's why his CPU wasn't working at all. I concluded that the chip was bad, likely because the two pins were bent so far back, maybe it shorted things and ruined the chip as a result, but it is certainly possible that the BIOS update just wasn't compatible with the CPU. It didn't cross my mind because, again, I thought we were dealing with the same 9th gen to 9th gen CPUs, and so that was my fault for just getting the CPUs wrong. It's an engineering sample. We'll talk about that in a second. So that's kind of the crux of this, is like I thought that because we were working the same generation, it couldn't have been a BIOS issue, because why would it be? They're essentially the same chip with some deactivated cores, etc. But because they were different, BIOS update definitely was needed. So that was totally on me, my mistake. I could say, oh, hindsight's 2020, it's easy for you guys to pick up on that. But some of you really impressed me. You guys picked up the BIOS revision on the screen that I just took a few shots of. You notice in the fine print the BIOS version, and you also notice the i5-8400. So I really need to improve that. That's something that I'm going to try to take, just kind of take it internally and work to improve with this playlist, is to focus more on the finer details, pay attention to the BIOS version, double, triple check that the CPUs I'm using are the correct ones, especially for dealing with engineering samples that aren't labeled otherwise. They're just called engineering samples. You don't know actually what chip it is until you connect it to a motherboard. And so conscious effort going forward. I do apologize for that, and kudos to you guys for picking up on that as quickly as you did. It impresses me how attentive a viewer base can be in these kinds of situations. The next thing I want to address is the engineering sample itself, whether or not me giving an engineering sample to someone to fix his or her system is illegal. A few folks thought that was the case. So look, the engineering sample, the way that looks for Intel, you'll see essentially an inscription on the IHS. It says something along the lines of Intel Confidential. And the reason why it says that is because engineering samples are often sent to board manufacturers. They're even sent to reviewers like ourselves ahead of time, before the product actually is released, before it hits the shelves. And so in those cases, yes, that is Intel's property. It is confidential property because it has not been public yet. It's not publicized. It's not purchasable in the market. And so that's why they have that inscription there. It is their property. And until the NDA, or the implied NDA for that engineering sample expires, we are not supposed to do anything with those chips outside of the scope of our own work, right? And this is kind of, this has been an issue with some board partners. They have received engineering samples, and then they have sent those out to reviewers along with their boards for testing, and then those reviewers will go and publish results for engineering samples for products that haven't been released yet. They break the NDA, but it's not really their NDA to break because it's the board partner's NDA, but they didn't really express that the NDA needed to be kind of transferred to the reviewer. So yeah, that's a can of worms. That it's kind of a side point here. The fact is, the chip I gave this person was an i5-8400. Okay, it did have Intel Confidential on the IHS. But this, we're talking about an 8400 here, a sub $200 chip released several years ago. It is no longer confidential. There's nothing about that chip that is news to anyone now because it's been out for so long. The NDA has long since expired. Now, whether or not you should be able to sell those chips, some people say it's permanently Intel's property because that's just the nature of engineering samples. However, I didn't sell anything, and even if I had, I still think you could have made a case for being able to do that because it's again, a very old chip, very cheap chip, and something that they don't really keep track of anymore because the NDA's expired, long expired. But I didn't sell this. I gave it to him. I just wanted him to get a system up and running again. That's it. That's all this was for. And so the notion that what I did was somehow illegal or going to ruin my relationship with Intel, I think is just complete and utter BS. Whoever's spewing this crap has absolutely no idea how this stuff works. And if I am completely in the wrong here, and Intel decides that what I did was just totally uncalled for, out of character, and we're going to sever ties with the Greg Salazar YouTube channel because he just did that. He just gave a engineering sample from several generations ago to a person who needed an Intel CPU to get his system back up and running. Fine, they can have that one. But I don't want to work with a company that reacts that way anyway to super old hardware. I don't think that's in Intel's best interest, and I knew all that going into this. I really didn't expect the admittedly minor backlash I got from using the engineering sample itself, but I just wanted to clarify why I did that, and yes, I'm going to continue doing that. If Intel decides, they don't want to sample me anymore, that's fine. I don't really rely on that kind of video content anymore anyway, but again, I highly doubt that it's a problem. And I was just worried about getting the person up and running again. And we did that. So that's, yeah, my take there. The next thing I want to talk about, just two more things, was the owner lying. Some of you thought that the owner quite possibly could have been lying because the CPU that was in the platform, or in the motherboard, wasn't compatible with the BIOS revision on the board. Now, again, I can't personally verify this because I didn't even think to look at the BIOS because I, again, thought we were dealing with the same generation of CPUs here. But if that was the case, then I suppose it's possible. I don't know the full story here. I don't think he was lying. I don't really think he had a reason to lie. And if he's watching this video, I'm not going to come after you and interrogate you. I really don't care. I imagine that I'm going to be lied to at least a few times making this series. It is what it is. It comes with the territory. But I don't think this person was lying. The reason why is because there are a lot of variables here. I know that the cooler was replaced, and along with the cooler being replaced, it's possible that the CPU might have been swapped out. And maybe he just left that part out. Maybe he told me and I just didn't mention it. I'd have to go back and look at the notes for the submission. I don't know it. I don't know for sure. But I don't think that there was any real deception involved here. The internet tends to look pretty... the internet's very scrutinous when it comes to viewer claims, especially when they're getting free services. They always tend to assume that people are just trying to freeload and take a handout. I do my best to vet these beforehand. If it seems like I'm just being planted this PC because this person wants an upgrade, then that's it. I move on to the next submission, and we have plenty of those. So it's not like I can be very choosy about this, but it has come up a lot. Even in the PCDC playlist, I'll get a very, very dirty system to fix or to clean, and I'll upgrade a thing or two there. And it's like, oh, that guy just took advantage of you. He had really crappy hardware, and you just gave him really nice stuff. That's all he wanted in the first place. Well, okay, yeah, I've kind of set a precedent of upgrading a thing or two in most of these videos. That's not news to anyone, and I actually do that to incentivize folks to drive out, to drop their systems off. a PC cleaning might not be worth even $100 to some folks. And on top of that, having to drive 2+ hours sometimes to meet me to drop the system off and then to do it all over again to pick the system back up once it's cleaned. That's not something that just your average person's gonna say, oh yeah, no problem, I'll do it, you know. Maybe they just wanna see their system on video, they can show their friends, that's fine. But I imagined in the beginning of this that I would need to incentivize folks to get them to come out. And if I could replace a case or a cooler, something that I get for free from companies, the companies are happy with the exposure and the viewers are happy with the upgrade, I felt like that was a win-win, you know, a mutually beneficial arrangement. And so far it has played out that way. So, you know, I know I'm not going to get rid of all of the all of the comments about, you know, being taken advantage of by saying what I'm saying here. Most of those folks probably won't even watch this video. But I wanted to let you know, the recurring viewer, the dedicated viewer, those who I appreciate the most, I wanted to let you know why I do this, why I do it the way that I do it. It's not random. I would like to think that it's strategic, and so far it's worked out pretty well, and that's why I don't want to change it very much going forward. The last thing is all about consistency here, and again, making another pledge to you, to an effort to try to be just more cautious about the smaller, finer details. You know, folks look at that last video and they might think, wow, the CPU was dead. At this point, I don't actually know for sure if it was. It's very possible that it wasn't. And so that part of the conclusion might have been wrong, and that would lead people to think certain things that they might not need to think if they run into a similar issue in the future. So this is why it's so important to me, because I don't want to mislead folks. And one of the reasons why I end all the videos the way that I do, for the most part, saying thanks for learning with me, is because I'm learning just as much as all of you. In fact, I might be learning more than some of you, because I'm the one actually doing the hands-on work here in the office. I've learned a ton from just the Fix or Flop playlist alone, and I don't want that to change going forward. But I also don't want to lose your viewership and your trust in me and my ability to diagnose an issue. So I'm making efforts to improve. I think we've done a pretty good job so far. I have made a few pretty blatant blunders. It's just, you know, I'm not surprised by it, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to minimize those and continue to inform folks and help them maybe troubleshoot their systems in the future as well. So I'm going to work on consistency. It's really important for this playlist. It's important for me as a person and for this channel. I think it just it speaks volumes when you can be honest about the mistakes for one, but then learn from those mistakes and kind of apply the things you've learned moving forward to ensure that they don't happen again. And if they do, it's just going to be a fluke, right? So that's all I've got here on my list of points to bring up. Thank you so much for watching this far into this one. Again, it's kind of an odd video, not the typical format. My kid's about to run in here, but I'm going to end this one. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks for learning with me. Uh-oh. Who's that? Is that Bugs? Are you trying to open Dada's office door? Oh, is it food time?
Yeah.
Oh, it's food time. You want to say hi to the camera?
Yeah.
Come here, say hi to the camera.
Hello.
Oh.
It's food time.
What's that t-shirt say? What's that t-shirt say?
ABC.
ABCs. It says, just like Dada.
Dada.
Just like Dada. Okay, all right, let's go eat. Let's go eat. I'm hungry.
I'm hungry too.